Welcome to our web development class. In this video, we will look at 3D transforms. However, there are limited support in the browsers, and currently they are best supported with the WebKit engine, which is Chrome and Safari. 3D transforms allow us to work with the z-axis, which gives us a 3D-ish effect. We've already worked with the x and y-axis in our 2D transforms. So as a refresher, we have looked at the 2D transform property, which takes a method as a value, and we give those different methods different parameters. For example, here we have transform translate, which essentially moves it from its original location, and we will tell it which direction on the horizontal and vertical axis. However, if you were to only give it one value, it would be the same for both x and y. Transform scale allows us to proportionally scale something up or down. Transform rotate takes 0 to 360 degrees. And skew, which is where we're changing the x and y corners of our container. Notice the first three are already working with the x and y axis, and they are also available as a 3D transform with the capabilities of working on the z-axis. So let's take a look at the translate method or value of the transform property. Notice the 2D syntax, and now the 3D syntax is adding some additional values. So we have translate 3D, translate x, translate y, and translate z. So we can manipulate the container in different ways. Let's look at the scale method or value. Here we see the traditional 2D syntax, where we can scale something up or down on a proportional basis. Now we have the 3D syntax, scale 3D, scale x, scale y, scale z. The rotate method, here we have the 2D syntax, where we can rotate something so many degrees. Now we have the rotate 3D, rotate x, rotate y, rotate z values. Transform perspective. We did not have this for the 2Ds. This is a 3D method or value, and it also exists as a property in and of itself. Either way, it works the same. It defines a perspective view for the transformed element, which is essentially gives you some depth perception. The greater the value, the further the distance and the less intense. The less the value, the closer the distance and the more intense. Although you might think it's the opposite, it's not. Alright, so this perspective exists as a method or value of the transform property. We also have a perspective property, where you can set a value. So here we see perspective set to 150 pixels, and that is the left image. Notice how there is more perspective, more different distance in the red block to its original enclosing container. The second line of code, perspective 550 pixels, is the right image. Notice how it is less intense and it's closer to the box. So the shorter the perspective, the more intense it is. One thing to notice that you're working with a child element inside a container that will get the perspective, not the outside container. So you need to have some kind of a positioning in order to have a container inside a container. We also have a perspective origin property, and here again we generally work in the center of the container. So here, if we wanted to change the origin to a percentage or a pixel value, we could do that also. The back face visibility property, a very interesting property. Here again, It has to do with a parent-child relationship, and you need to have positioning to do this. And this has become a relatively cute little effect that has been emerging on the web. You may have seen it, where you can hover over something and it flips around and you can see the back of it. It's really not the back of it, it's another container, but it simulates a card being flipped over. And if you were to Google this, you might want to Google card flip, CSS. And what this involves is having two things overlapping each other, and so that you can't see one over the other, you would set the back face visibility differently. It would also work in conjunction with some of the other transform properties, such as rotate Y. We also have animations, which also work very well with transitions, and there's a lot of overlap and similarity. I guess the syntax and the theory is just a little different. All right, so an animation lets you change from one style to another. So does a transition. All right, you can change as many properties as you want to, as many times as you want to, and you can do that with transitions also. And remember, you can only animate or create a transition on something that has some kind of a measurable unit, such as pixel, percent, colors. All right, now the difference between an animation and a transition. Transitions only can happen with a hover. Remember, the transition property is set with the default properties of the object to which the transition will be applied. The property that is being changed is called from the hover on that container. All right, so animations can work the same way with a hover, or they can just automatically happen when the page loads. So that is what, in addition to the syntax, that is the theoretical difference between the two of them. All right, so you need to use the @keyframes rule. You need to specify keyframes, or example, different points on which the animation is going to be changing. Here again, the animation can change from one to another over a period of time, which would be a transition, but you can have it gradually do different things along that path, so to speak. And you need to give your animation a name also. So let's take a look at the syntax here. Here we have some properties set for a div. We have a background color, and we have several animation CSS properties that refer to aspects of the animation. You can also use a shorthand for this. All right, animation name, that's a custom name, whatever you want to call it. The duration, similar to a transition duration. A delay, similar to a delay in a transition, which is optional. So at minimum, you need the name and you need the duration, and that's all you need. There is a timing function, similar to a transition, the default being ease, the other values being the same as for the transition. The animation direction, okay, so it normally goes in its pattern. You can reverse it, you can alternate it, or you can set it back to normal. The animation iteration count, by default it does its thing once. You can tell it to essentially loop for an X amount of number of times, or if you set it to infinite, it will continue doing it until the user leaves the page. So this is kind of nice. All right, so once you have coded in your values, your animation properties are set to the container, just like the transition is set to the container. However, unless this is happening on a hover, all you would need to do is to set the @keyframes, which is where the changes are coming in. All right, so the @keyframes directive, and you have to name the name of the animation, and in those parentheses is where you would be defining what the animation is going to do. So here we're going from a red background to a yellow background. All right, let's take a look at this slide. Here for our div container, we are using the animation shorthand. So we have a custom name for S for the duration, an infinite, and an ease in. And here again, the browser pretty much knows what these values are based on how they're used. So let's take a look at the at keyframes with the custom name here. We're moving it from the left and top, 25% through the animation. The background color changes to yellow, we move it again. 50% through, the background color changes blue, we move it again. 75% through, the background color changes to green, we move it again. And 100% at the end of that animation, which is 4 seconds, so a lot's happening within 4 seconds. Maybe we should change it to 5. 1 second per each. Now it's going to end up at red, back up to the start again. Let's go to the internet, and the URLs for what you're about to see are on Blackboard. I'd like to show you some very nice examples. Alright, this is the CodePen application, and I like this application very much. It's a very easy way to see nice little examples. In the bottom part, you notice there's the actual web page. In the left, we see the HTML. In the middle is the CSS. On the right is the JavaScript. However, there is no JavaScript, but in a real-life situation, there very likely could be. A lot of applications involve, obviously, 3 different parts. Alright, so if you notice, we have some navigation, and a lot of these new properties and effects work so nicely with navigation. Remember, most of them are called on a hover, and that's something we generally do to navigation. Alright, so when I put my cursor here over LinkedIn, there is a little icon sitting there. Alright, and notice it goes all the way around. But notice it's on an angle to start with. So if we take a look at our HTML, and I realize this is on a black background, so it's a little difficult to see, we have one outer div, and inside that div we have 3 other divs. We have a div for the orange, a div for the lighter blue, a div for the other blue. And inside each of those divs we have the image. So we have those images relatively placed in the right location in those little rectangular containers there. Alright, so if we look at the CSS, all of the images, there are 3 images here, they are all sharing the same properties. They all have a margin, and take a look at the transform rotate. They're all initially set to rotate at 20 degrees. So when the page loads, we're putting them there. So you don't really need to have a transition to have use a transform property. The rotate works very nicely for just putting something on an angle, especially things like pictures. Alright, notice we do have the transition set to the image. Alright, we're going to transform it over a period of 0.3 seconds, very fast, and we're going to ease it in. And notice we have the vendor prefixes. Alright, so if I scroll down a little bit more here, there's a couple things going on. We are rotating everything. We are rotating that image 380. Why 380? Well, because it's already 20. So in order to get it back to its original point, we need to rotate it 380. 360 wouldn't work. I'm thinking of the other example. Okay. And that's pretty much all there is to it. We're just rotating on a hover. And everything else is just pure CSS. So when I hover over, rotates in, rotates out very fast. And actually, if you wanted to spin it, you could double that 380, and you can spin it around twice if you wanted to. You're not limited to one spin. You can spin these things as much as you want. I think they're kind of nice. Sometimes you might see things moving up and down or moving out, like a left-hand sidebar, things like move out, which looks kind of cool also. Alright, let's move on to the next example, and this is like my favorite. Alright, what we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 images, and they're inside a div. And remember, you can only do this in Chrome. Look at this in Firefox, you're not going to see it. So, when I hover over something, notice that they're all kind of angled in here. When I hover over something, the background grays out, and the one that I hovered over comes out in front. It is no longer on an angle, and it has an opacity of 1, and it's much larger. So let's take a look at this. And this is done with everything we've been learning. Look how nice this is. Alright, so let's take a look at our CSS here. And a very interesting thing is that we are using a lot of pseudo classes here. So to begin with, we have 5 images inside a div. So the first image, and I believe the div has absolute positioning, whatever. We have relative position, we have margin, we have width and height, we have a perspective. Okay, so they're all set with a perspective to bring them out. They're all rotated Y. So here's our 3D transform. Perspective and rotate Y. They're all rotate Y at a 45-degree angle. However, if you look at them, you can tell they're not all at a 45-degree angle, but some of them are. Alright, so what did we do here? We started out, remember, the browser reads from the top down. We started out, everything is set to a rotate Y of 45 degrees. Now, when we, and there's where our transition is set. Our transition is set for a 0.3 second. We have a Z index because we have positioning here. Alright, let's take a look at the hovers because that code comes next. Remember, they're all enclosed in a div called with ID equals hover. So we have 5 images enclosed in a div ID equals hover. So when the hover is over inside that ID, when I hover into that container, I am setting the images the opacity of 0.6. So when I hover into this container, all of the images, the opacity for all of them is going to 0.6. That's how we're graying them out. However, the image that I actually hover on, this is where we have the transform. Remember, the transition is set to the image, and the property that is being transformed is set onto the hover. So we have the transform here. And remember, a lot of these are all values or methods of the transform property. So here we have rotate Y 0 degrees. So no matter what we hover over, we're pulling it back to 0 on the Y. We're straightening it out because they're all on angles. And we're scaling at 1.5. Isn't that nice? And we're also changing the opacity to 1. Remember, all the opacities change to 0.6 when we hover over the container. But now when we directly hover on the image, the opacity is changed back to 1. Okay, our rotate Y is set back to 0, and we're scaling it up. I really like this. All right, now, to get back to how the other ones are rotated on different angles, because we started out with general properties being set to every image, including the rotate Y 45 degrees, we are using our structural pseudo classes. Alright, so here we are. IMG nth child 3. Alright, we're setting, which is the middle guy here. Notice there's no rotation at all. He's normal. So we're overriding the general. We have a general style set for everyone. However, only the ones where we're overriding the rotate Y's. We're not overriding the rest. The rest are still inherited. So we have an nth child 3, an nth child 4, and an nth child 5. Where we're an nth child 4 and 5 are on the negative 45. The first two are on a positive 45 on the rotate Y. So here again, the URLs are on Blackboard. These are nice examples to give you a feel for how this stuff works. All right. The last one, and I have the code in the sample code for you for this one. This is something that you're probably seen on the internet. Common. You might hear it referred to as the card flip. And here again we have a very nice little embedded editor here where you can just see the raw HTML. So here again, the basis behind these things are, we have 2 divs that are being flipped, and they're inside an outer container, and they're positioned on top of each other. So the outer container has relative positioning. The 2 ones inside are directly on top of each other. They are absolutely positioned to the parent, which is relative. Now with the CSS, we do have a perspective set for the whole container. There are some shared classes. I believe they both share the classes of card and face, but we have front and back. Alright, so front and back are the classes for the individual ones. They both share the class of card and face. The class of card is where the transition is coming set, and it's transition all, 0.4 seconds linear, about half a second here. And we start out with the first one, the back face, visibility hidden, so you don't see the one behind it. And then here's the front. And when we hover over it, all we're doing is rotating it 180 degrees, which enables you to essentially, it flips it around so that you can see what's underneath it.